August 15th, 1943. Rüst, Diesel, Stalebrett. That was the smell of the voyage. In the ship's hold, German prisoners tried to sleep. No chains, only exhaustion. Their boots had marched through Europe's ruins. Now, they were cargo, silent, waiting. Some whispered about American cruelty. Others clung to old propaganda. But beneath it all was a silence they couldn't escape, fear hiding behind pride. The voyage across the Atlantic was no cruise. Salt air stung their throats. The groaning of the hull reminded them, with each wave, how fragile their situation was. Above deck, guards paced with rifles, their uniforms crisp and alien. Below, the prisoners tried not to imagine torpedoes, for the war at sea still raged. But it was not torpedoes that haunted them most. It was hunger. Their rations, stale bread, thin soup ladled without care, did nothing to quiet stomachs used to years of scarcity. In Germany, ration cards had already become prayers written on paper. When the ship finally made harbor, they expected the smell of ash and gunpowder, a shore bristling with barbed wire and snarling guards. Instead, as the gangplank clattered down, they were hit with something else entirely. The mingled aromas of coffee, roasted meat, and fresh-cut lumber from the Oklahoma docks. To men who had marched through burned villages, that smell was a shock in itself. For the first time since capture, their eyes lifted. America did not look like a land at war. It looked impossibly whole. The journey inland began with trains. Boxcars rolled through plains so vast the men pressed against the slats just to glimpse the horizon. In Germany, a horizon meant shell fire or rubble. Here it was wheat fields, endless and golden, dotted with barns painted red, as if from children's drawings. They passed towns where neon lights glowed at night, something many had never seen. They muttered among themselves. How could a country so far from the front be so untouched, so plentiful? Klaus Weber whispered to Heinrich Müller that surely this was theater staged to impress them. At last, the train slowed. A camp waited, a stretch of Oklahoma land fenced, but not festooned with barbed cruelty. Watchtowers present, but oddly unthreatening, barracks lined in neat rows like some farmers' outbuildings. The prisoners shuffled through gates, expecting a harsh welcome. Instead, a sergeant with a clipboard spoke in curt but fair tones, organizing them into groups. They were issued bedding, soap, and clothing that, though plain, was cleaner and sturdier than what most had worn in months. The air smelled faintly of prairie dust and cedar, not of fear. Then came the first meal. The line moved into a mess hall where tin trays clattered against metal. At first they assumed it was another cruel joke. Mountains of bread stacked in baskets, steaming pots of stew, thick slices of meat, and pitchers of coffee poured without ration cards. Klaus Weber froze, unsure if they were being tested. One guard, sensing hesitation, barked, "Eat." And so they did. The bread was soft, the meat tender. Coffee, real coffee, burned their throats, waking memories of pre-war breakfasts long forgotten. Heinrich Müller devoured greedily, his pride cracking under the sheer abundance. The second week in camp brought a meal that none of the prisoners could have imagined. It came not with fanfare, but with the quiet clatter of tin trays sliding along a mess line. The men had grown used to bread, meat, and coffee, strange luxuries in themselves. But this day, the cooks ladled something new onto the trays. A pale golden smear pressed between slices of soft bread. It clung stubbornly to the knife, thick and oily, with a scent both nutty and sweet. The guards called it peanut butter. Klaus Weber sniffed cautiously, pressing his nose close. Heinrich Müller jabbed at it with suspicion, muttering that Americans would eat anything. But when they bit, hesitation turned to astonishment. The paste coated their tongues, clung to their mouths, forced slow chewing. Some grimaced, others chuckled nervously, but most kept eating, confused yet fascinated. To men who had lived on turnips and ersatz coffee, even strangeness was a feast. The real thunderclap came afterward. Near the end of the line, guards handed out small rectangular bars wrapped in foil and brown paper. Klaus Weber took his cautiously, unwrapping with care. Inside lay chocolate, real chocolate, glossy and dark. The taste was overwhelming, rich, sweet, unashamedly abundant. For men who had not touched chocolate in years, who had watched their children lick crumbs from empty wrappers, it was unbearable. One soldier, thin as a scarecrow, covered his face with his hands. Another laughed, but the laughter cracked, collapsing into sobs. By the time the line was finished, more than a few were weeping, their tears falling into the brown paper wrappers like raindrops on relics. Klaus Weber stared at the Hershey's name stamped into the squares, fingers trembling. Heinrich Muller's jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the small miracle in his palm. The sweetness did not just feed their stomachs. It fed memory. Each bite pulled them back to a Germany before ration cards, before bombed-out streets, before hunger hollowed their families. They thought of wives who stood in lines that stretched around blocks for scraps of margarine. They thought of children sucking on crusts of bread like bones. And that chocolate was not joy but grief. To taste abundance when your family, starved, was a cruelty wrapped in kindness. The guards noticed. One young American, hardly older than the prisoners, shifted uncomfortably as he watched tears streak across sunburned German faces. By autumn, the camp no longer felt like a holding pen for defeated men, but like a strange halfway world where war's fury could not quite reach. The barbed wire remained. The watchtower stood tall, but inside the perimeter life took on rhythms that seemed almost ordinary. The prisoners rose at dawn, filed to the mess hall, and ate meals that still astonished them. Yet what lingered more than food was the slow unfurling of encounters, moments that blurred the lines between captor and captive, enemy and neighbor. The first came with work details. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could labor so long as it was not directly war-related. In Oklahoma's farmlands, that meant harvesting. Columns of German POWs marched out under the prairie sky, guarded but unchained, and set to work in fields of wheat, cotton, and corn. Farmers, their sons overseas, watched these men bend to tasks once done by neighbors now scattered across battlefields. At first, suspicion hung heavy. But when the crops came in faster, when barns filled with grain, gratitude replaced weariness. Some farmers left jugs of water in the shade. Others left slices of pie wrapped in wax paper. Klaus Weber took an apple given by a farmer's wife, eating it slowly, savoring each bite. Snow fell softly over the camp, muting the clang of boots on gravel, turning the barbed wire into delicate strands of frost. It was Christmas Eve, 1943, and though the war raged with fury in Europe, here in the heart of Oklahoma, a fragile peace hung in the air. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall, a drafty space lit by kerosene lamps, the smell of pine from a makeshift tree mingling with steam from pots. On each table lay Red Cross parcels, brown paper packages tied with string, their contents almost unbelievable. Tins of fruit, cigarettes, canned meat, and once again, the unmistakable weight of Hershey's chocolate. Klaus Weber turned the bar in his hands, staring at the familiar stamped letters. His eyes shone with more than hunger. He whispered that his sister back in Dresden had not seen sugar in months, that children were breaking teeth on turnip bread. Heinrich Muller sat stiffly, the foil crackling in his fingers, and muttered that this was cruel, this sweetness that could not cross the ocean. Yet when he bit, his jaw trembled, and he looked away so the others would not see his tears. Around the hall, voices rose in carols. Germans sang Stillnacht, soft and trembling. Spring came, and with it the war's turning tide. News filtered through. Germany collapsing, cities burning, Hitler's promises unraveling. The prisoners listened, torn between dread and relief. Some still clung to loyalty, but many admitted, at least in whispers, that defeat was inevitable. The real conflict was no longer whether Germany would fall, but what kind of men they themselves would be when it did. The chocolate, the peanut butter, the pies from farmers, these had planted seeds of doubt in the soil of their old convictions. Klaus Weber confessed one evening that he no longer dreamed of medals or parades. He dreamed of bringing his sister to a place where bread was soft, where candy was not a miracle. Heinrich Müller, who had once barked slogans, now sat carving small toys for local children, his hands steady, his silence no longer hostile but thoughtful. The camp had not broken them with punishment. It had disarmed them with humanity. But the most devastating moment was still coming when they saw the photographs that changed everything. The camp library became a place of reckoning. American newspapers provided an uncensored view of the war's end and something else. Photographs from liberated concentration camps. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Auschwitz. The images were devastating. Skeletal bodies piled like cordwood. Survivors who looked like ghosts. American soldiers weeping at what they'd discovered. These camps bore German insignia, had been staffed by German personnel, operated with German efficiency. Many prisoners refused to believe the photos were real. Others wept, recognizing uniforms of units they'd known, sometimes faces of people they'd worked with. Klaus Weber studied the images with a soldier's eye. These weren't propaganda. They were documentary evidence of industrial murder. Heinrich Müller stared in silence, his carved wooden toys forgotten on the table beside him. Here's the devastating irony. Instead of using German knowledge of atrocities as justification for revenge, Americans organized educational programs to help prisoners understand what had been done while emphasizing individual responsibility and redemption. Abraham Goldstein, a Jewish-American psychiatrist, counseled traumatized German prisoners. Despite everything his people had suffered, he treated Germans with professional compassion. Collective guilt is poison, he told them. It paralyzes people. What matters is individual responsibility and the choice each person makes going forward. You can't undo what was done, but you can ensure it never happens again. Spring 1946. After nearly a year in American captivity, repatriation finally came. The parting ceremonies were emotionally complex. American guards and German prisoners who'd worked together now faced permanent separation. Some exchanged addresses, others shared wordless embraces. Lieutenant Anderson gave Klaus Weber a leather journal. "You're a good man and fine soldier. Hope we can work together again in a world at peace." The Henderson family from Tulsa sent a final care package with an invitation to visit Oklahoma someday. The journey back was as civilized as everything else. Clean ships, adequate food, medical care. But as they approached Hamburg, Klaus Weber saw his homeland's devastation. Hamburg was a moonscape of rubble. The harbor, once bustling with merchant ships, now hosted only Allied military vessels. His city was gone, replaced by an archaeological site where people picked through ruins. Heinrich Müller found his family's apartment building reduced to a pile of bricks. He found his mother in a basement shelter with 12 other families surviving on American relief rations. The reunion was heartbreaking. His mother, once plump and energetic, was gaunt and aged. His father was missing. His brother was in a Soviet prison camp. But even here, the contrast jarred their consciousness. American occupation forces distributed food, medicine, supplies to German civilians. Their policies were firm, but not vindictive. They were rebuilding, not just punishing. "They could let us starve," Heinrich Müller's mother whispered, sharing American beef stew. "After what we did, they could let us starve, but they feed us." I don't understand it. Neither did Heinrich. But he was beginning to understand something else. The kind of person he wanted to become. The story could end there. But the most powerful part is what happened next. How one generation's experience rippled across decades. The Germany Klaus Weber and Heinrich Müller returned to wasn't just physically destroyed, but morally bankrupt. Former believers struggled with cognitive dissonance. Many retreated into denial. Others, like Klaus and Heinrich, began the difficult work of reconstruction, both external and internal. Klaus found work with medical relief organizations, treating refugees and displaced persons. The skills he'd learned alongside Americans proved invaluable. But it was the attitude he'd absorbed that made the biggest difference. He treated all patients equally regardless of background, shared resources fairly, refused petty nationalism. These were distinctly American management styles. Letters from America continued arriving. The Henderson family sent updates on their daughters. Lieutenant Anderson shared medical research. Corporal Davis sent photos of his new baby. These relationships served as bridges between worlds, proof that the kindness had been genuine, not strategic. Years passed. Klaus Weber married Anna Fischer, a fellow medical worker who shared his commitment to healing. They raised 3 children in West Germany, teaching them that enemies could become friends, that kindness was stronger than hatred. Their children grew up hearing stories about American captivity, not as tales of suffering, but as examples of unexpected grace. They learned that paradise could exist in unlikely places, that people could transcend their worst impulses. When the Marshall Plan began rebuilding Europe, Klaus welcomed American aid not with resentment, but with gratitude born of personal experience. Heinrich Müller became a teacher, sharing stories of Oklahoma farmers who gave apples to German prisoners. He told his students that hatred was a choice, not an instinct. Decades later, America would finally recognize them with the Congressional Gold Medal. The Germans, who once mocked them as blackbirdmen, ended the war acknowledging their skill. The bomber crews, who survived because of them, called them red-tail angels. And history would remember them as men who fought 2 enemies at once, fascism abroad and racism at home, and defeated both.